After today's episode with Dwight, I plan to take a break from the pod just to focus on getting my body right, getting mentally right, help this squad make a push towards our goal. He can't be our most consistent player. Like, we all got to step our shit up and match that energy.
Paul George is about to be traded again, and if you really did a deep dive into this, it's not surprising why. Paul George signed a max contract with the Philadelphia 76ers last offseason. He was supposed to be the missing piece in taking this team all the way to the NBA Finals. Instead, he easily became one of the worst contracts in all of sports. By February, Paul George had uploaded 288 videos to his YouTube channel since joining the Philadelphia 76ers. The amount of field goals he made at that time was 197. A man getting paid $212 million has literally been more productive as a YouTuber than a basketball player. And if you think that's bad, just wait until you hear the rest of this story, because what I'm about to tell you is going to blow your mind about how spectacularly this Paul George experiment has crashed and burned. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why Paul George is about to get traded for the 4th time in his career. So before we get to the content, make sure you drop, like, subscribe, and turn on our notifications to get the latest NBA news to your device. And now that we get all that out of the way, cue the intro. The last time PrizePicks gave us a free square, we were easily able to cash with a 4-man play. And now they're giving us one final free square for Game 7 of the NBA Finals. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander only needs 1 point. I'm going to post my free square pick on my Instagram page, at TheFlightMike. If you haven't signed up for PrizePicks, use my promo code microphone and you'll get $50 in lineups when you make a play of $5 or more. If you want additional plays, check out our Discord server in the WAP link in the description right below that. And thank you, PrizePicks, for today's sponsor. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? We need to start with how terrible Paul George truly was this past season, because he finished with what might be the worst season of any max contract player in recent NBA history. We're talking about a man who signed a 4-year, $212 million deal and then proceeded to average 16.2 points per game. To put that into perspective, that's his lowest scoring average since he was a sophomore in the NBA back in 2011 to 2012. This is a guy who was supposed to be the 3rd piece of a championship puzzle alongside Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey, and instead he scored less per game than players like Austin Reeves and Alperen Şengün. But it gets worse. Way worse. Paul George only played in about 41 games this season. That means he was unavailable for half the season. You're paying a guy $51 million this year, and he's sitting on the bench more than he's playing. And when he was playing, he was terrible. Paul George shot 43% from the field, 35.8% from 3. All career lows for a guy who is supposed to push you to championship contention. But here's where it gets really embarrassing. His player efficiency rating dropped to a 14.5, which is below the league average. This is a superstar who built his reputation originally on being clutch, on being the self-proclaimed playoff P, and he's literally performing worse than replacement level players. And his injuries don't bring you any more confidence. He hyperextended his knee in the preseason, missed the first 5 games with a bone bruise, constantly dealing with adductor issues, and then boom, he was shut down for the entire season on March 17th. They had to give him injections in both his knee and his adductor muscle just to try to get him functional. And typically, if you're any other player in the NBA, this would just be a bad season, but it seems like Paul George was consistently reminding us about how terrible he was because of his podcast. Paul George was consistently putting up historically bad numbers, but do you know what he was consistent at? Uploading podcast content. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this became the biggest meme in the NBA this past season. The internet absolutely lost it when someone posted that Paul George had 228 podcast clips versus 191 field goals made at the time. Another count showed 288 total videos. That's shorts, clips, full episodes, and everything, compared to just 197 field goals. That tweet got over 58,000 likes in under 24 hours because people couldn't believe what they were seeing. The man was more consistent than I was, and this is my full-time job. And think about that for a second. A man is failing spectacularly at his day job, the job he's getting paid generational wealth to do, and he's spending more time creating content about basketball basketball than actually playing basketball well. And these podcast episodes were just disastrous. Earlier in the season, he said that the 76ers couldn't be good with Jared McCain as their best player.
He can't be our most consistent player. Like, we all got to step our shit up and match that energy.
And ironically, another top sports commentator, Bill Simmons, roasted Paul George perfectly for this.
Kyrie, we know he has it in him. Paul George is like a cat. He'll jump on your lap every once in a while. He's super lovable. Other times you're like, where's Paul George? Oh, he's in the garage.
But the moment that the dude really showed how out of touch he was came on February 25th, 2025. The morning after the 76ers got absolutely smacked by the Chicago Bulls, 142-110. And I mean, they got their asses kicked on their home floor. Paul George decided that this was the perfect time to announce that he's going to take a break from his podcast.
After today's episode with Dwight, I plan to take a break from the pod just to focus on getting my body right, getting mentally right, help this squad make a push towards our goal.
This is one of the funniest pieces of content I've ever made because I was in shock at the time. The guy came out when the Philadelphia 76ers were 20-37 and basically eliminated from playoff contention and said, you know what? I'm going to make a championship push right now. I'm actually locking in at this point, which makes it even more funny because Paul George as a podcaster is not a good podcaster. He's just giving his haters ammunition to use against him and just show how out of touch he truly is. And you know what the worst part about all this podcast drama was? It created actual locker room problems. Throughout this entire disaster of a season, Paul George had multiple moments where he showed that he was completely disconnected from reality. And I'm about to break down the most cringeworthy examples that had fans ready to run him out of Philadelphia. The first major incident happened back in November 2024. The team had a private meeting after some struggles, and details from that meeting got leaked to the media. Normal teams usually handle this stuff internally, but Paul George decided to go on his podcast, clickbait the fact that the Sixers weren't doing that well, and then started discussing what happened in that confidential team meeting.
I don't know how the hell Shams got that story or how that even leaked. Some of it being like kind of word for word, or like teams go through that. I've been on multiple teams where we'll at some point have a meeting and a check-in. We know we could be playing better and we're trying to get the most out of one another. That's normal. So like, that's just where we're at with it.
Fans were furious, saying he was airing out the team's dirty laundry and treating their struggles like content for his show. Imagine being in a locker room where you can't trust your teammate not to put your private conversations on the internet just for clicks. But the absolute worst moment, and I mean the one that really showed how disconnected this guy was, happened after they lost to the New Orleans Pelicans at home. This was the Pelicans without Zion Williamson, by the way. One of the worst losses of the season. After getting embarrassed on their home floor, Paul George decides to complain about playing center. Here's his exact quote. "It's different. I'm used to scrapping and running around and chasing and fighting through screens. To be honest, I'm bored playing the 5. It just doesn't do it enough for me. But I think being mindful of my ability to clog the middle and kind of help cut off passing lanes and driving lanes and kind of battle with the bigs is what Nick Nurse sees in that style. But again, I enjoy chasing the little guys and matching up against wing offensive players. And it's not like he was that great on the wing either." The disconnect was so real that when fans saw him during the Eagles Super Bowl parade, you know, an actual championship celebration, they immediately started roasting him. One fan stuck in traffic recognized him and said, "Yo, we could have kept Tobias Harris if you're gonna do this." And now here's where things get really interesting, because the trade rumors around Paul George are starting to heat up, and some of the potential destinations are actually pretty wild. And by the way, I don't think any of these teams are teams that could potentially win a championship with Paul George. So it's important to understand the situation before we break down where Paul George is getting traded, because it's really complicated. The teams that would be interested in trading for Paul George are teams that have a tremendous amount of cap space and are willing to take on a terrible contract in order to get some assets in return, pump up Paul George's value, and hopefully trade him to another team in a year or so when his value is inflated. Now, before I get to this, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say that both Mark Stein and Jake Fisher provided a conflicting report to my theory. And I have tremendous respect for both of these insiders, but I wanted to make sure I got you guys the best information. Fisher explicitly stated that the Sixers would be looking to package the number 3 overall pick in order to move on from Paul George are not true. And he believes that they are looking to give their big 3 of Joel Embiid, Paul Paul George and Tyrese Maxey another chance after just playing 15 games together. At the same time, Andy Larson of the Salt Lake Tribune said that the Philadelphia 76ers and Utah Jazz have discussed a trade involving Paul George. But this wouldn't be the Philadelphia 76ers completely moving on from their number 3 overall pick in order to get rid of Paul George. Instead, they would be downgrading that draft pick. They would move the number 3 overall pick to Utah in exchange for taking George's contract, and they would move down to the number 5 overall pick. But a trade between the Utah Jazz and the Philadelphia 76ers would be very hard to conduct, primarily because what players do you give up to get Paul George? The Jazz would not trade Lauri Markkanen, John Collins, and Colin Sexton and the number 5 overall pick to Philadelphia for Paul George and a number 3 overall pick. Utah hasn't really shown much allegiance to John Collins and Colin Sexton, so they could trade John Collins, Colin Sexton, and Keyshawn George in addition to the number 5 overall pick to the Philadelphia 76ers, get Paul George in return, and the number 3 overall pick. This would mildly downgrade their roster. It would give the Philadelphia 76ers much needed depth. It would get them out of Paul George's contract, and it would also downgrade their draft pick. But let's say that's not what ends up happening. What other teams could potentially be interested in trading for Paul George? And if the Utah Jazz aren't interested, then probably the most likely destination for PG would be the Brooklyn Nets. The Brooklyn Nets are in a very interesting situation. They have over $50 million in potential cap space, but they have this cap space in a very interesting free agency class. There isn't a home run free agent that they can go out and pursue and bring over to their team, which means if they wanted to really make the most of this cap space, a trade with the Philadelphia 76ers to get Paul George and some additional assets might be in the books for them. But there's a big problem. Who would they trade for Paul George? They could offer Cam Johnson, D'Angelo Russell, Noah Clowney, Whitehead, and Keon Johnson in return for Paul George. But the thing is, they'd be giving up way too much to get back a depreciating asset, so there's no question in my mind, in order for this trade to go down, the 76ers would have to give up the number 3 overall pick. The most interesting trade scenario would be the Phoenix Suns. I personally don't think this is going to happen at all. Jonathan Givony said in May that some teams expect the Sixers to be active in trade conversations with names such as Kevin Durant and Lauri Markkanen as potential targets and packages that could include Paul George and the number 3 pick. Sixers president of basketball operations Daryl Morey has made a career of being active and aggressive on the trade front, but historically it's rare to see a top 3 pick being traded. In this case, it would make a lot of sense because a trade for Kevin Durant would instantly put the Sixers in contention, and you do need to pair the number 3 overall pick to dump the worst contract in sports off the books. But personally, the number 1 contender to potentially trade for Paul George would be a rebuilding team that is in the market to take on a reclamation project, rebuild his value, and then flip him on the market maybe a year or so later. Very similarly to what you saw the OKC Thunder do with Chris Paul after the Houston Rockets traded Chris Paul to the OKC Thunder for Russell Westbrook all those years ago. This type of trade would basically be the Philadelphia 76ers admitting complete organizational failure. When you have to attach a top 3 draft pick just to get rid of a player you signed less than a year ago, that's a level of disaster we rarely see in the NBA. The financial math on this situation is staggering. If the Sixers could somehow move Paul George's contract, they'd save $51.7 million in just the first year. That would drop them way below the luxury tax and give them the flexibility to actually build a roster that makes sense around Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey. They could easily find a replacement for Paul George in the NBA draft. I mean, Ace Bailey is quite literally being compared to Paul George, assuming he doesn't decimate his draft stock, which we made a separate video on that, and I'll leave it in the end screen for you guys to check out. But here's why trading Paul George might actually be the best thing that could happen to Philadelphia, and it's not just about getting rid of that contract. First, the roster construction becomes so much easier. Right now, they have 3 guys who all need the ball: Embiid, Maxey, and George. If you move Paul George, Tyrese Maxey can become the clear secondary scorer and playmaker. You can surround Embiid with actual complementary pieces instead of trying to force another high usage star into the mix. Second, the timeline starts to make sense. Joel Embiid is 31 years old and has a lot of injury miles on him. Tyrese Maxey's just 24 years old and is entering his prime. If you can get younger players or future assets for George, you're building for Tyrese Maxey's peak years instead of desperately trying to win now with a flawed core. And finally, the salary cap relief is just massive. $51.7 million in space means you can go after multiple quality role players instead of being stuck with minimum salary guys to fill out the roster. Fortunately for the 76ers, they have been incredible in the NBA draft. draft. It's their free agent acquisitions that they're terrible at. The craziest part about all this is Paul George has basically turned into a case study of how not to handle a superstar trade situation. And the NBA history books are full of similar disasters that we can learn from. Do you remember Russell Westbrook with the Los Angeles Lakers? Just like George, Westbrook was supposed to be the third star that pushed a team over the championship edge. Instead, he refused to adapt his play style, became defensive about criticism, and eventually had to be traded after creating a toxic situation because he was getting paid a supermax contract to shrink the floor and the Lakers had no depth behind him. Look at Carmelo Anthony's later career. After forcing his way out of New York, Melo had disappointing stints in OKC and Houston where he couldn't accept a reduced role and kept creating drama before being moved again. Even in Philadelphia, they've seen this before with Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons was another star player who became more of a distraction than an asset and eventually forced his way out while creating a toxic atmosphere that damaged his own trade value. But here's what makes Paul George's situation even worse. This would be his fourth major trade. Indiana to OKC, OKC to the Clippers, Clippers to Philadelphia, and now potentially Philadelphia to somewhere else. And at what point do teams start asking if the problem is the player, not the situation? I mean, look at what happened to the Oklahoma City Thunder after they traded him to the Clippers. They got Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and a bunch of picks that turned them into the championship contender they are today. I mean, even look at the Indiana Pacers. They're facing off against the OKC Thunder in the NBA Finals. That would not have been possible if they never traded Paul George. So here's why I'm confident that Paul George is about to get traded again and why it might happen sooner than people think. First, the statistical production just isn't there anymore. You can't justify paying a player $50+ million to average 16 points and miss half the season. That's not sustainable for any organization. Second, the locker room dynamic is clearly broken. When your teammate is discussing private team meetings on his podcast and complaining about being bored after embarrassing losses, that's not a chemistry that you can fix. Third, the fan base has completely turned on him. Paul George made an appearance on the WWE, and let's just say he wasn't well received. Finally, the financial math makes trading him almost inevitable. With the new CBA and luxury tax implications, teams can't afford to have that much money tied up in declining production. So let me know in the comment section down below, where do you think Paul George is most likely to get traded to? My personal prediction is any team that is clearly headed towards a rebuild, that is willing to take on this terrible contract and get assets for doing so. Let me know in the comment section down below what you guys think about all this. Aside from that, I don't know if you guys heard, Ace Bailey is doing a remarkable job sabotaging his draft stock. I have a completely separate video. I'm going to leave it in the end screen and meet you guys there. I'm your boy Mike. I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.